Won't eating fat make me fat? There is a resounding answer to that question, and it is no. You are not what you eat. Eating fat helps your body be in a position to use fat for fuel. It's training, it's putting in place the metabolic machinery to address that problem. Now, I need to pick up the pace a bit. Now, clogging arteries. I'm going to, at the risk of getting too deep, here is the most scientifically supported theory as to how we develop plaques in our blood vessels. Because if you are afraid of a heart attack or stroke, it's because you are in fact afraid of what's called atherosclerotic plaque formation, or atherogenesis. This is the process of creating this lumpy little thing in our blood vessel that would grow to the point that it blocks the blood vessel to the heart, starving the heart of blood, and then a part of the heart dies. That is the myocardial infarction, aka heart attack. So you probably already know that aspect, but I want you to appreciate that process that I've outlined there. So we have this process of lipid accumulation. It can be in the form of cholesterol or individual fat molecules that we call fatty acids. Those can accumulate in the blood vessel wall. But mind you, they accumulate everywhere. They're fundamental parts of every single cell in our body. You have to have cholesterol and fatty acids coming into cells, or the cell cannot exist. It is physically made of those molecules. That is the majority of what is actually making the membrane or the wall of the cell. So that in and of itself is not a problem whatsoever. Now, so in fact, these lipoproteins, LDL, VLDL, are what's carrying these molecules. And you know LDL cholesterol, of course. It's gotten a very bad rap, but I won't get into that. Lipid oxidation. When these molecules, cholesterol and fatty acids, have been what's called oxidized through reactive oxygen species or oxidative stress, now they turn from benign into villains. They're no longer heroes. They're no longer beneficial to the cells. They are now overtly harming the cell. These are extremely, we call them radical. They're damaging. These are very damaging, very dangerous molecules. These lipid peroxides, or these oxidized lipids. Now what happens, because these molecules are so dangerous, the body has a way to try to get rid of them. And so we have this immune cell, the macrophage, or monocyte, as it's known as it's flowing through the blood, comes to save the day. The monocyte will move into the blood vessel wall and start gobbling up those lipid peroxides, or those villainous lipids. Remember, they're only villainous because they become oxidized. Now that macrophage is loaded with fat. It becomes what's called a lipid-laden macrophage, and it becomes a foam cell, because when you look at it under a microscope, it looks foamy. Looks like it has little bubbles of air, but they're bubbles of fat. It's those fats. So then the foam cells start to accumulate. They are very pro-inflammatory, so they start releasing proteins that increase inflammation throughout the body. And then these proteins actually start to call more macrophages to come. So we have this accumulation of these very inflammatory foam cells, and this becomes the heart of the atherosclerotic plaque. There, now you know. In fact, now you know more than many conventional medical practitioners, actually. I mean that, in all sincerity. This is the most scientifically validated or justified theory for how we get a plaque forming. So this plaque is at the heart of heart disease, heart attacks. Now, of all of this process, what was so essential was the formation of the lipid peroxides, or the oxidation of the lipids. If that doesn't happen, we don't start the process. I hope, is this getting too boring? No. You guys still here? Okay, good. I need to, it seems like you're paying attention just because you're not staring at your phones.
How does your wife do this?
Yeah, mind you, this is not pillow talk in the Bikman home. Things can get a little more exciting. Okay. Shh. Come on, we're all grown-ups here. Yeah, this is sexy, she says, yeah. That's how I got my wife to marry me. I said, sweetheart, I'm going to be bald in a year from now, but I got a beautiful brain. You just got to take my word for it. Okay, I actually had more in the marriage contract than that, but I'm already being a little moderately inappropriate, so I'll stop. So, all right, so we have to ask the question, if the lipid must be oxidized for it to be atherogenic, how does the lipid become oxidized? There are some lipids that are so prone to oxidation that the moment you open the bottle and expose them to oxygen in the atmosphere, they get oxidized. There are some that are so profoundly resistant to oxidation that you have to heat them to about 300 degrees Celsius before they can get oxidized. It is against its natural state. They're so stable. Now, as I mentioned there, the more unsaturated bonds between the carbon molecules, and I'll get into this more, the more likely, the more prone it is to becoming a lipid peroxide or a damaging, villainous lipid. So here I have two examples. Which one has more unsaturated bonds? And we identify that by a double bond. Which one, top or bottom? The bottom one. And in fact, that is the so-called vegetable oil. It's seed oil in reality, but things like soybean oil, cottonseed oil, what are some other ones? Canola, safflower, all from those little seeds, those industrial oils that they have to add deodorants to them at the chemical plants because they stink so horrifically as they get oxidized. You smell the rancid oils because they become rancid or oxidized extremely readily. In contrast, you take something like coconut oil. No, you have to heat the coconut oil up to a very, very high temperature until those bonds can become oxidized. This is very well established. This is very well documented. Talk to any chemist. I'm not a chemist, I'm a biochemist. They will tell you, in fact, as you scan the entirety of biomedical literature, if you look for polyunsaturated oxidation, you'll find thousands and thousands of articles. You try to find even one article that talks about oxidized products from saturated fats, nothing. It doesn't happen in normal biological conditions. So anyway, some of the science there, but I'll come back to that point in a minute. What I want to convey here is that we look at LDL as a villain, and I'm not going to get into this in too much detail, in fact, not beyond this. The fat that the LDL molecule is carrying, yes, it can carry some cholesterol, which is not a problem. You have to have cholesterol. How many people want more testosterone and estrogens? That comes from cholesterol. How many people want vitamin D? That comes from cholesterol. How many people want, you won't know this protein necessarily, but ubiquinone? It's a necessary part of the mitochondria. You can't burn fat without cholesterol. It is essential to human health. So, LDL is, yes, carrying cholesterol, but it's also carrying a lot of fats. Guess what makes up those fats? It's the fats that we eat. So if you're eating more, say, saturated fat from real sources like animal and fruit fats being coconuts, avocados, olives, those are fruits, they're not seeds, there's no vegetable fat. When anything that says vegetable oil, it's from seeds. That becomes, those saturated, very stable fats become part of the fat being carried throughout the body, indeed even on LDL. In contrast, if you're eating a lot of those artificial industrial oils, they become a part of your LDL, part of the fat traveling through the blood. And this matters because, as you'll see here, you look at the dietary fat sources in the US in the last 100 years, look what went from zero to main fat, soybean oil. 70 years ago, we didn't eat a single ounce of soybean oil. It has become the single most common source of fat in the Western diet. I say the Western diet, but in fact, it's even worse in countries like India, actually. And that's part of why I believe in India there's such a pandemic of diabetes. It's because of this focus on these seed oils, and in fact, very little omega-3. As an aside, I'm talking about what's called an omega-6 polyunsaturated fat. It's called linoleic acid. It's an omega-6. One of the ways to offset some of the damage that omega-6 linoleic acid can do is by eating a similar molecule, but that can't be used the same way, and that's omega-3. Omega-3 can combat or disrupt the body using that omega-6 in such damaging ways, and indeed, it can really only be damaging. But you see soybean oil, and what's the next one? Shortening. That's also based on seed oils, another omega-6 polyunsaturated fat. So the two most common sources of fat in this Western diet, that is now, of course, the global diet, are loaded with linoleic acid, which is this omega-6 fatty acid. And we always want to implicate beef and red meat. No, we don't eat any more red meat than we did 100 years ago. In fact, if you combine beef and pork, we eat less. So don't blame the red meat for what those oils are doing. All right, so linoleic acid. If we start to look a little beyond the conventional blood measurements that we get, yeah, we're going to get LDL from our physician, our doctor's visit, total cholesterol. We want to know what's on the LDL. What are the fats it's carrying? This study found that in this big analysis, dietary linoleic acid, that's that omega-6 polyunsaturated fat, was the most important determinant of the maximal oxidation velocity. So if they took LDL molecules and determined how rapidly can the fats on this molecule become oxidized, it was entirely dependent on how much linoleic acid the person was eating. This study, cholesterol as well as diets rich in saturated fat have been postulated to accelerate the risk of atherosclerosis, while food rich in unsaturated fats, like the seed oils, the linoleic acid, have been claimed to lower the risk. However, the fact is that these lipid radicals, what I'm talking about, these lipid peroxides or oxidized lipids, generated from polyunsaturated fats can oxidize cholesterol to toxic levels. And that would then, of course, drive the atherosclerotic plaque. And at the bottom, I love their conclusion. A serious reconsideration of the health and diet guidelines is required. No kidding. Yeah, and that's what we're doing. That's what we've done, indeed. All right, this is a neat study. I have to just mention it. In Sydney, the Sydney Diet Heart Study, they actually took a big cohort of people. They said, you keep eating what you're eating. You eat less saturated fat, which are real fats from animals and fruits that we as a species have been eating since time immemorial. They said, you eat less saturated fat and rather focus more on these seed oils. Guess what happened? They died more. Their all-cause mortality, meaning dying from anything, went up. Same with heart disease and cardiovascular disease. The great irony is we're telling people, well, not me, the powers that be are telling people, you got to eat these seed omega-6 polyunsaturated fat oils. And they're dying more, even from heart disease. This is not the only study. A huge study in the US about 50 years ago found the same thing. And there's another study called the Shanghai study that I won't show you, found the same thing. More stuff. For the sake of time, I'm just going to speed up. But in sum, when people want to try to vilify saturated fat, you say, show me the data. And you only want to look at clinical studies. You just want clinical studies. You don't want big epidemiological studies. But speaking of epidemiological studies, throughout Europe, there was something once called the French paradox. We don't understand. The French eat a lot of saturated fat, and yet they have almost no heart disease. It's not unique to France. In fact, if you look across all of Europe, there's this inverse relationship. The countries that ate the highest amount of saturated fat as a percent of their total fat calories had the lowest level of heart disease mortality. This study actually was an intervention. They took people and they said, look in that box that I've expanded there on the right, they told a group of people, you have to eat half of all of your calories from saturated fat. That's pretty remarkable. It basically became a diet consisting of cheese, meat, and eggs, which sounds pretty delicious, frankly. But what's their conclusion? This high saturated fat diet, again, half of all calories, which is pretty extreme. It resulted in weight loss after 6 weeks without any adverse effects on serum lipid levels. So all they did was lose weight and their blood lipids looked fine. Okay, so is it going to clog my arteries? The answer is absolutely not. And when you get challenged on that, I encourage you to say the most fundamental pathogenic aspect of the development of a plaque is the oxidization of the lipid. A lipid must be oxidized for it to be atherogenic. And the person can generally say, okay, that makes some sense, I guess. And then you say, well, what are the lipids that are the most oxidized? That's when the whole story starts to fall apart. And you can say that's why we can justify focusing on real ancestral fats rather than these new modern industrial oils. All right, so what I hope you remember as my time